Have you ever wanted to disappear completely while federal agents scream into telephones and chain smoke themselves into emotional collapse? Well, now you can. Introducing the Frank Matthews Disappearance Starter Kit, the only premium escape package trusted by alleged international kingpins, mysterious fugitives, and men who absolutely should not have been released on bail. For just 4 easy payments of $19.93, you too can enjoy luxury fugitive essentials like 55-gallon drums for storing enormous amounts of suspicious cash, a pair of sunglasses so powerful they legally count as a new identity, 1 fake passport with the name Frank Not Matthews, a complimentary Lincoln Continental air freshener smelling faintly of cocaine and bad decisions. But wait, there's more. Order now and receive our exclusive How to Vanish Without Leaving a Single Useful Lead training course, featuring educational lessons such as how to make Interpol absolutely miserable, escaping the DEA using nothing but confidence, why you should never trust a casino cashier, Todd Hill annoying the Mafia since 1972, and of course, Was es heute be wow and more menornas, our legendary bonus feature, How to Become a Federal Nightmare. Watch in amazement as trained investigators spend 40 years arguing whether you're A. Dead, B. Alive, C. In Venezuela, D1 in Algeria, E. Somewhere drinking espresso while reading newspapers about yourself. Side effects may include federal indictments, wiretaps, international manhunts, mysterious disappearances, paranoia, silk suit addiction, and causing organized crime historians to lose sleep for generations. The Frank Matthews Disappearance Starter Kit. Because if you're going to become a legend, at least leave the feds confused. Disclaimer. The following program is intended for educational, historical, criminal analysis, and how the hell did this guy pull that off purposes only. We do not glorify drug trafficking, heroin empires, organized crime, cocaine-fueled decision-making, or skipping court with enough cash to make a casino accountant start sweating through his polyester suit. This documentary discusses real criminal history, law enforcement investigations, fugitives, narcotics trafficking, the Mafia, alleged corruption, and one of the most bizarre disappearing acts in American underworld history. No crimes are being encouraged. No lifestyle is being promoted. And if your grand plan is to become a drug kingpin after watching this, congratulations, you missed the entire damn point. This is history, not a tutorial. So pour the espresso, lock the back door, and remember, in the pizzaverse, we don't worship criminals. We study the wreckage they leave behind.
Frank Matthews, the Kingpin Who Vanished. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. Produced by Pizzaverse Studios. Presented by Palermo Productions. Some criminals get caught. Some criminals get killed. Some criminals get turned into movies, legends, or cautionary tales. And then there's Frank Matthews, a man who built one of the biggest drug empires in American history, challenged the Mafia's control, made an obscene fortune, and then, when the walls finally closed in, did the one thing nobody expected. He vanished. No body, no confirmed sighting, no final confession, no neat Hollywood ending. Just money, mystery, and a federal case file that still smells like failure. So, we're diving into the story of the Kingpin who didn't just beat the streets. He beat the ending. The man who disappeared. How can you be the head of one of the biggest drug trafficking networks in history, run away with the equivalent of over $100 million in today's money, and disappear without a trace? I think only Frank Matthews holds that secret. Ranked by the DEA as one of the top 10 drug traffickers in U.S. history, Frank Matthews had an incredible story, yet few people talk about it. Based in Brooklyn in the 1960s and 1970s, this young African-American gangster, still in his 20s at the time, was indeed at the head of one of the greatest criminal empires this world has ever known. His fortune was estimated at $300 million, the equivalent of $2 billion today. A colossal fortune acquired through the sale of heroin and cocaine throughout the eastern United States. His network was totally independent of Mafia control, which was extremely rare for an African-American gangster, and I'd like to say, for an American gangster at all. By freeing himself from the Mafia, Frank Matthews had done better than his predecessor, Bumpy Johnson, and also better in terms of fortune than Frank Lucas, the heroin dealer popularized by the film. But then again, few people seem to know about this. No doubt Hollywood didn't want to popularize a criminal who had managed to beat the system, because can you imagine a gangster movie with the thug running off with the money at the end? Studio executives would have had nervous breakdowns. Some producer in a turtleneck would be screaming into a phone, "Wait, the criminal wins. What is this? Reality?" Because that's exactly what Frank Matthews did, even though he was supposed to appear in court. He disappeared from the face of the earth just like that, with his girlfriend and over $100 million in his pocket. A completely surreal and enigmatic end to a criminal career. In short, a mysterious gangster who certainly deserves to have his story told. So, get ready to dive into the most intriguing unsolved case of recent decades. He had been identified as one of the largest, if not the largest, heroin traffickers in the United States. He was in a league of his own, and he was not only an organizer but a businessman. There have been a lot of recent movies about Frank Lucas being the king of drugs. That's not true. Matthews was the #1 heroin pioneer. I'd say he was definitely smarter than Frank Lucas. Where he is today, God only knows. I think he's alive, and I say this unequivocally because he was a smart person. All of the agents who worked on the case to this day believe he's still alive. Durham, North Carolina. The life of Frank Matthews is, how can I put this? One hell of a mystery. But what's even more of a mystery is his youth, about which we really know very little. The reason is the many conflicting accounts from people who supposedly knew him. Ricky Johnson, a native of Durham, the North Carolina town from which Frank Matthews came, tells us, "You hear so many stories about Frank Matthews, it's hard to distinguish what's what. They all have a different version of growing up with him. You realize a lot of what you hear is really just rumor." Another Durham resident agrees. A lot of people like to make up stories so they can be in the limelight. They say they ran with Frank, sold drugs for him, but then you realize they are younger than Matthews and not from the same generation. They just want to be a part of the legend. You know the type. Every neighborhood's got 'em. Guy hears one story in a barbershop in 1987, and suddenly he's acting like he personally smuggled heroin across the Atlantic in a raincoat carrying 2 revolvers and a duffel bag full of destiny. As for those who really knew him, well, they generally avoid talking about it. As one Durham native who claims to have known Frank puts it, "You ain't going to get people from here to open up about Frank. They're either thinking you're with the law or they fear they may say something that can come back and bite them." People here are cautious. Many think Frank Matthews is still alive. You never know who's listening or what may get back to him. So, It's not easy to get a clear picture of Frank's youth, but there are a few things we can learn about his early years. Frank Larry Matthews hailed from Durham, North Carolina. He was born there on February 13, 1944, into a family he hardly knew. We know nothing about his father. As for his mother, she died when he was barely 4 years old. From then on, young Matthews was raised by his aunt, who took him in and raised him as her own son. He lived in the poorest district of Durham, a city renowned at the time for being home to one of the most prosperous black communities in the country, despite the segregation in force. A Durham native and friend of Matthews recalls, "During the segregation days, Durham had everything a black person could want. We had a lot of black wealth per capita. We had more black millionaires than any city in North Carolina." The atmosphere of this period gave young blacks the incentive to try to achieve more, which I'm sure Frank was inspired by, without a doubt, by all the successful black entrepreneurs in Durham. Al Bradley, an author who has written extensively on Frank's life, would say, "Matthews must have seen lots of black-owned businesses and successful black men when he was growing up. That later gave him the chutzpah to circumvent the Italian Mafia in the drug business. That was unheard of at the time. Something in Matthews' upbringing gave him the confidence to stride fearlessly into a world that didn't respect him." Frank made his mark from an early age, especially with his classmates and the boys in his neighborhood. He seemed to be a born leader whom children his age wanted to follow. People who knew him as a child used the same two words to describe him: strong and charismatic. Qualities that would later enable Frank to compete with New York's most ruthless gangsters. At school, however, the picture was not the same. Frank lacked seriousness and seemed disinterested in his schooling. What he preferred was to be on the streets, an environment in which he was like a fish in water. No wonder he dropped out of school at an early age. All he wanted to do was make money. As one of his childhood friends recalls, even in those days, he was all about money. Frank was a hustler. Frank Matthews could also be generous to his loved ones. On the other hand, you didn't want to mess with him because he could also turn violent. As another of his comrades points out, Frank was a natural who would fight anybody over anything. He could, however, be aloof and reserved. As this other friend reveals, people bragged that they knew Frank, but they didn't really know him. You could never really get close to Frank. As a teenager, he became the leader of a gang, and he was involved in several petty crimes, including the theft of chickens from a local farm, which led to his arrest at the age of 14. And honestly, there's something incredible about the fact that one of the biggest drug traffickers in American history started his criminal resume stealing chickens. Imagine being the detective years later reading that file. Wait a minute. This international narcotics mastermind started out boosting poultry. That's unbelievable. He later joined a hairdressing school, but only stayed there a few months. According to a Durham native, this was because Frank had been caught stealing barber's equipment. The same person also adds, "Not too long after that, I saw Matthews on Fayetteville Street. He said he was going to New York to make money." From barber chair to Brooklyn hustler, Frank left his hometown of Durham in the early 1960s to seek his fortune. Still in his teens, he set off to pursue his dreams of fortune by heading northeast, initially for Philadelphia. He stayed there for about a year. During this time, he worked as a barber and a numbers collector for a numbers game racket. Through this illegal activity, which was widespread at the time, Frank met other ambitious young people who, like him, were looking to make money. And back then, the numbers racket was everywhere. Before state lotteries started smiling at people through television commercials, pretending gambling was wholesome family entertainment, the streets already had their own version. Only difference was the state didn't get its cut yet. But, as mentioned, Frank didn't stay long in Philadelphia. In 1963, or perhaps 1964, he left for New York. A logical choice for Roger Duray, a police detective who had investigated him. New York was a city of opportunity for an ambitious gangster, as well as for those who wanted to make an honest living. It was the center of everything. Money. Power. Politics. The Mafia. The heroin trade. The hustle. If you wanted to become somebody in the underworld, New York was the major leagues. Frank moved to Brooklyn and continued to do what he had been doing in Philadelphia, working as a hairdresser while organizing illegal gambling. He continued this activity for some time before tiring of the numbers game racket and turning to a more profitable business: drug dealing. Frank was quick to see that the black drug dealers in his neighborhood were lining their pockets. So it didn't take long for him to decide to follow. As Inspector Roger Duray points out, I think Frank woke up one morning and decided to hang up the barber's white jacket. Frank said to himself, I'm going to be the dude who wears the $300 silk suits and drives a Lincoln. And that right there? That's the moment the barber disappeared and the kingpin was born. Not in some dramatic movie montage with violins and slow motion. Just a young hustler looking around Brooklyn, realizing the guys cutting hair were surviving, but the guys selling heroin were becoming kings. And once Frank Matthews saw the scoreboard, there was no going backwards. Heroin takes New York. In the 1960s and 1970s, an illicit substance spread massively in New York: heroin. At the time, the drug was creating a veritable epidemic, fueling violence and disorder in the black community. A chaos that one of the city's former police officers remembers. The year after King's assassination, we had more than 2,000 homicides in New York. The majority of them were in Harlem, and I'd say about 85% of them were drug-related. It got so bad that if a cop working in Harlem gave someone a summons for double parking, it could easily have led to a small-scale riot. That's how close to the edge Harlem was in the late 1960s. The city was burning slowly. Not with flames. With addiction. And heroin didn't just destroy neighborhoods, it transformed them. Entire blocks became open-air economies built around desperation. Junkies chasing the next fix. Dealers chasing the next shipment. Politicians pretending they didn't see it. And organized crime quietly counting cash behind the curtain. Drug dealers like Frank Matthews and Nicky Barnes became heroes because people looked upon them as defying a system that didn't work. That's the ugly reality of environments where institutions collapse. When the system fails people long enough, eventually the hustler becomes the folk hero. Not because he's good. Because he looks powerful. Frank took advantage of the situation, and in order to get involved in the flourishing drug trade, he had no choice but to make contact with the criminal organization that controlled the supply and distribution of heroin throughout New York. The Great La Cosa Nostra. In the 1960s, the drug trade on the U.S. East Coast, and particularly in black communities, was controlled by New York's 5 major mafia families. The Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Bonanos, the Genoveses, formerly the Luciano family, and the Colombos, formerly the Profaci family. At the time, if heroin was moving through New York, chances are the Mafia had its fingerprints on it somewhere. For a time, the trade was dominated by Jewish gangsters, notably an organized crime figure who, as early as the 1920s, had grasped the lucrative potential of this illegal trade, helping to organize and expand it in Uncle Sam's country. Then, in the 1930s, the Italian Mafia, seeking to diversify after Prohibition, joined the Jewish underworld in drug trafficking before monopolizing the market in the following decade. After the Second World War, heroin, which the Mafia trafficked, was imported from Italian refineries. These refineries closed after the Italian government decided to ban heroin manufacture in the early 1950s. Left with no choice, the Mafia looked for other sources of supply, and it was here that the French Connection was born. Not the movie, the real thing. A sophisticated smuggling pipeline in which opium was cultivated in Turkey, sent to France for processing in clandestine laboratories, and finally distributed throughout the United States. A global criminal assembly line. This network, which thrived in the 1950s and 1960s, enabled the American Mafia to continue trafficking drugs in the United States and New York. To penetrate this market and start selling his first kilos of heroin, Frank Matthews had to go through the Cosa Nostra. The Mafia says no. To penetrate this market and start selling his first kilos of heroin, Frank Matthews had to go through the Cosa Nostra. He did this by trying to form a partnership with the Gambino and Bonanno families, but for one reason or another, they turned him down. Many would have been discouraged by this refusal, but not Frank. He was young, ambitious, and determined to make his mark in the dope business. And honestly, this is where Frank Matthews starts separating himself from a lot of other gangsters of the era. Most people at that time would have accepted the hierarchy. The Mafia controlled the pipelines. The Mafia controlled distribution. The Mafia controlled the streets. You either kicked up to them, or you got buried under a bridge wearing cement loafers. That was the reality. But Frank Matthews looked at that system and basically said, "Yeah, no." So he persevered until he found another opportunity. An opportunity that came from Spanish Raymond Marquez, an acquaintance of Frank's known at the time as the king of the underground lottery in Harlem. He had connections, which he passed on to Frank, putting him in touch with a Cuban gangster by the name of Rolando Gonzalez Nunez, a major cocaine supplier who, in the 1960s, was one of the biggest coke dealers in New York before fleeing to Venezuela because of legal problems. Frank got in touch with Rolando and the deal was sealed. He bought his first kilo of cocaine for $20,000. And just like that, Frank Matthews found the loophole. If the Italians wouldn't open the front door, he'd build his own entrance. That decision changed everything. Because once Frank established independent supply lines outside traditional Mafia control, he wasn't just another dealer anymore. He became competition. Real competition. The kind that makes powerful people nervous, especially in New York. Especially in the 1970s. Especially when the guy doing it is young, fearless, charismatic, and making millions while the old guard watches from across the street, pretending they ain't sweating. That's dangerous territory. And Frank Matthews was walking straight into it with a cigar in his mouth and silk suits on his back. The empire expands. The relationship quickly developed into a drug trafficking network. The Cuban drug trafficker regularly sent him large shipments of cocaine and heroin from South America, and Frank expanded his business by reselling the product in New York. It didn't take him long to make his mark, becoming one of the city's biggest drug dealers in just 1 year. At the time, Venezuela was one of the Latin American countries where the Cosa Nostra was established for drug trafficking. It was a strategic location, particularly thanks to its geographical proximity to the United States. an ideal base which the French Connection used to transport its heroin to Latin America and distribute it to Miami, one of the main points of entry to the United States for drug trafficking. The Corsicans, with their ability to infiltrate and corrupt governments, were responsible for transporting the drugs to Venezuela. Then the Cubans would send the heroin to the United States before it was distributed throughout the country, including New York, where Frank, thanks to his collaboration with the French Connection and the Cubans, had become one of the city's biggest dealers. His network with the French Connection and the Cubans was paying off handsomely, although Frank knew he had to diversify. To do this, he set out to find new sources of supply and was prepared to do business with anyone, as long as the product was pure enough. Matthews was always willing to pay premium prices for multi-kilo shipments of pure heroin, if that was the best he could find. In the end, Frank was just the opposite of La Cosa Nostra, who sold its drugs at exorbitant prices with no regard for the quality of the product. And that's part of what made him so dangerous. Frank Matthews wasn't thinking like a street dealer. He was thinking like a corporation. Supply chains, quality control, distribution networks, market expansion. The guy was basically running a Fortune 500 company made entirely out of heroin and paranoia. And unlike a lot of gangsters whose egos eventually wreck the operation, Frank understood something important. If the product was better and cheaper, people would keep coming back. That mentality allowed his organization to expand at terrifying speed. And so it wasn't long before his network expanded even further, supplying drugs to nearly 21 different states, particularly on the east coast of the United States. It never reached California, but in time it certainly could have taken over the whole country. As U.S. federal prosecutor William Callahan reports, if Matthews' wings hadn't been clipped as they were in 1972, he would have eventually dominated the national scene, and then he would have become a truly international kingpin. I think Matthews was so ambitious that could have been his ultimate goal. That's the part that really jumps out. The authorities weren't describing Frank Matthews like a local gangster anymore. They were describing him like a future global criminal executive, and that terrified people. Because once somebody proves they can operate outside Mafia control and still make billions, the whole old system starts looking fragile. Frank Matthews wasn't just making money, he was rewriting the rules. More money than the mob. Frank Matthews' profits from heroin and cocaine trafficking were staggering. It is said that he made up to $600,000 a day, and that his fortune was close to $300 million, the equivalent of $2 billion today. A fortune he amassed in the space of just 4 years. According to Litty Jones, a former associate of Frank's, no gangster in New York at the time earned more money than him. The Italian Mafia made a lot of money, but they couldn't touch Frank. He had more money than the mob. Now stop and really think about that sentence for a second. More money than the mob. In 1970s New York. That's not some random street rumor from a guy sweating in a social club trying to impress people over espresso and cigarettes. That's a statement that would have made organized crime figures across the city grind their teeth. Because money is power. And in organized crime, whoever controls the money eventually starts believing they control the world. Litty Jones then recounts this anecdote from the early 1970s. I had a good friend who said she knew somebody in Brooklyn who could give me all the smack I needed. My friend was tight with an associate of Frank. I asked for 5 keys and got it for $22,000 a key. I began making real good money from my connection to Frank Matthews. I learned I wasn't anything special. All the top drug dealers along the East Coast were getting their dope from Frank. It was amazing to make a deal with him. He never really counted the money. You could have shorted him thousands of dollars and Frank wouldn't have known. That right there tells you how enormous the operation had become. Frank Matthews had reached a level where money itself almost became abstract. When somebody's moving that much cash every single day, stacks of bills stop looking like money and start looking like inventory. 5 years after his arrival in New York, Frank Matthews had become the biggest drug baron in the city. Even though he was barely in his 20s, he had created his own drug trafficking network, completely independent of the Mafia, which was quite a feat for an African-American gangster. That independence matters. Because Frank wasn't just surviving beside the Mafia, he was outperforming them. That's a very dangerous thing to do in New York, especially during an era when organized crime families still viewed themselves as untouchable kings of the underworld. The old guard tolerated successful hustlers. What they hated was competition. And Frank Matthews was no longer a hustler. He was becoming an empire. Taut Hill and the Silk Suits. At the start of his criminal career, Frank Matthews was rather reserved in his lifestyle. He lived in a modest flat and didn't seem to do anything crazy. As Rick Talley, a former New York drug dealer who knew Frank in the late 1960s, recalls, "In those days, Matthews did not really stick out in the crowd in the way he was dressed, the way he talked. Frank looked and moved more like a country kid from North Carolina than a polished gangster." However, as his drug empire grew, Frank began to take on a completely different role. He would dress in expensive clothes, cigar in mouth, and drive around in luxurious cars, showing off with beautiful women. The barber from Durham was gone. Now came the silk suits, the Lincoln Continental, the cigars, the swagger, the kingpin mythology. And let's be honest, every gangster eventually reaches the same dangerous moment, the point where making money stops being enough. Now they want people to see it. Frank also traded in his modest flat for a mansion in the wealthy Taut Hill district of New York, a neighborhood that at the time was known for housing some of the city's most notorious mobsters, including Paul Castellano, the future godfather of the Gambino family, who had his home directly opposite Frank's mansion. There were also some members of the Lucchese family, and Frank was the only black man living there. No black people lived there, and some of the most powerful mobsters were just a stone's throw away from Matthews's house. In the Matthews era, the only black people you could see in Taut Hill were the hired help. Even today, black residents comprise just 1% of Taut Hill's population. And that right there, that's a statement. Frank Matthews didn't just become rich. He moved directly into the lion's den. Imagine the visual for a second. Italian mob bosses peeking through curtains watching this young black drug kingpin pulling into the neighborhood in luxury cars, smoking cigars, wearing designer suits, and making millions outside their control. You think that didn't bother people? Come on. That probably caused more heartburn than the cocaine. Otherwise, Frank was a heavy cocaine user, if not a drug addict. Donald Goddard, an author who took an interest in his life, recounts, "By the autumn of 1972, Matthews showed the classic symptoms of chronic cocaine abuse, shuffling between extremes of euphoria and irritability. This helps explain Matthews' frequent irrational behavior and the way he handled drug deals." William Callahan, the federal prosecutor who investigated the Matthews case, adds, "During the course of our investigation, we learned that he had a rapid, irregular heartbeat. So, by abusing cocaine, Matthews was risking his health, an addiction that didn't stop him from continuing to expand his empire and amass even more money. That's the contradiction at the center of so many criminal empires. The same thing helping fuel the machine. eventually starts destroying the man running it. And by the early 1970s, Frank Matthews was beginning to look less like a disciplined entrepreneur and more like somebody trying to outrun gravity itself. The Kingpin Summits. It's amazing to see what he did as a self-made man and how he built a criminal empire on his own. I think the only people in organized crime history comparable to Matthews are, and Frank can indeed be compared to Luciano and Escobar in the sense that, like them, he was the organizer and master of ceremonies of summits between kingpins. One took place in Atlanta in October 1971, during which he invited the country's biggest African American and Hispanic drug traffickers with the aim of improving the distribution of heroin and cocaine. The other took place in Las Vegas the following year, during the fight between and it was a meeting where similar topics were discussed, such as the need to establish stronger independent relations with the Corsican and Cuban Mafia in order to free themselves from the control of the Italian-American Mafia. And this is where the story stops looking like ordinary street crime. These weren't random guys standing around on corners, passing envelopes and yelling across Cadillacs. These were organized criminal summits. Business conferences for the underworld. The only difference between this and Wall Street was the possibility of somebody getting shot during intermission. An American anti-drug agent recounts, "When we began checking out the license plates and the intelligence on who was in attendance, we could see it was a meeting of the who's who of black organized crime. Matthews was the reason they came. At the time, he really was the country's biggest black kingpin. That sentence matters. Matthews was the reason they came. That means Frank Matthews had become more than a drug dealer. He had become a central figure, a connector, a power broker. Somebody capable of pulling major traffickers from around the country into the same room under his influence. That's not local power anymore. That's national influence. And the bigger Frank became, the more dangerous he looked to everybody around him. To the Mafia. To federal agents. To rival traffickers. To politicians. Probably even to some of his own associates. Because history shows us something over and over again. The moment somebody starts building an empire outside the established system, powerful people begin asking the same question. How long before this guy becomes untouchable? And Frank Matthews was getting dangerously close. At the time, he really was the country's biggest black kingpin. Group 12 starts watching. It was then that the authorities began to take a closer interest in him. Las Vegas was a place where Frank Matthews often went. Like many drug dealers, he loved a city that had legalized gambling. Frank went there to gamble, to have a good time, but also to launder his money. As federal prosecutor William Callahan points out, we heard Frank would take duffel bags full of cash to a casino and give them to a cashier. The casino would take 15 to 18% for laundering his money. And people wonder why Old Vegas became legendary. The city was basically a neon washing machine for dirty money. Everybody knew it. Nobody cared. As long as the cash kept flowing and the cocktails stayed cold. The strange thing was that the authorities didn't even have him on their radar. Frank Matthews had illegally made his fortune and risen to the top of the underworld, and no one in the police force seemed to know about it. In 1970, Matthews' name did not appear on any of the major criminal violators lists kept by the authorities. He was a non-entity. Think about how insane that is. A man moving millions of dollars in heroin and cocaine across nearly half the country, and the system barely knew he existed. That's either brilliance on Frank's part, incompetence on the government's part, or a little beautiful cocktail of both. In fact, it wasn't until shortly after the Las Vegas summit in 1972 that the police finally started tapping his phone. It was the investigative group known as Group 12 that took a serious look at his case. Its aim was to find a way to indict drug baron Frank Matthews. The investigators included William Callahan, whose role was to coordinate the investigation, and Gerard Miller, a DEA agent with 20 years' experience in organized crime. Group 12 had to gather all the evidence they could to prove that Matthews was involved in drug trafficking. Not an easy task, given that Frank's only criminal record was for stealing chickens. And again, that chicken arrest comes back like the world's strangest foreshadowing. Imagine trying to explain this case to another department. So let me get this straight. The biggest heroin trafficker in America has one arrest for poultry theft. That sounds less like a federal investigation and more like the setup to a terrible Jersey joke. Besides, Gerard Miller couldn't understand how such an influential drug trafficker had managed to escape the vigilance of the police so far. And how could an African American in his 20s be involved in drug trafficking in almost 21 states of the country? It was a perplexing observation for the agents, including Miller, who said, "I hate to say it, but Frank was ahead of us from the beginning." And that's the moment the investigators realized something terrifying. They weren't chasing some reckless street gangster. They were chasing somebody smarter than the system built to catch him. The case against Frank Matthews. The investigation was therefore not easy to carry out, especially as Group 12 was under a great deal of pressure from its hierarchy to obtain results. And a lack of resources made available to carry out the investigation didn't help matters. The agents only had 3 months to produce something significant, which was very little, especially to nail a gangster of Matthews' caliber. In reality, it would have taken several years of investigation to achieve a convincing result. But Gerard Miller and his colleagues did their best with the resources at their disposal. It was thanks to them that Frank Matthews' telephone calls began to be tapped. In 1972, the U.S. anti-drug authorities then lent their support to the case, followed by Interpol and the U.S. Tax Service, with whom Group 12 was working closely to pursue the drug baron. Together, they succeeded in locating and seizing assets belonging to Frank, including several real estate properties. The investigators then tried to tail his car whenever they could, but Frank was faster than them and always escaped, breaking every possible rule of the road. Frank was probably under the influence of cocaine during these chases. Or did he know in advance that he was being watched? Corruption was widespread in the NYPD at the time. Either way, it wasn't worth continuing for Gerard Miller, who tells us, "It didn't really matter. We knew it was futile to follow him. He didn't seem to fear anything. He once opened the boot of his car in broad daylight, took out kilos of drugs, and gave them to an individual in full view of everyone. That's unbelievable behavior. Not careful. Not subtle. Not paranoid. Untouchable. That's how Frank Matthews was starting to act. Like a man who either believed nobody could stop him, or a man who had already accepted he was too big to live normally anymore. And honestly, there's something almost surreal about the image. Middle of the day. Public street. Trunk pops open. Kilos of narcotics getting handed out like groceries. Meanwhile, the investigators are sitting there probably looking like exhausted accountants, wondering how the hell this became their lives. As if Frank Matthews didn't give a damn about law enforcement surveillance. And maybe he really didn't. Because by this point, Frank Matthews had spent years outmaneuvering everybody. The Mafia couldn't control him. The police barely understood him. The feds were scrambling to build a case against him. Success on that scale creates a dangerous mindset. Eventually, some criminals stop believing they can lose. And historically, that's usually when the fall begins. The arrest. But it was only a matter of time before things turned in the investigators' favor. In the early 1970s, Matthews' network continued to supply the United States with illegal substances and generate millions of dollars in revenue. Group 12's investigation progressed to the point where it caused the first damage to the drug baron's empire. It began with the arrest of several of his associates. The arrests followed one another over time, with tongues occasionally being loosened, giving Group 12 more and more evidence to flesh out their case. After a year's investigation, the authorities finally had solid evidence to bring down Frank Matthews. All that remained was to arrest him. The arrest took place at 11 a.m. on January 5, 1973. Frank was at Las Vegas International Airport with his girlfriend, flying to Los Angeles, when the authorities stopped him to handcuff him. Sometime later, they had obtained an arrest warrant for tax fraud and conspiracy to traffic drugs. Matthews had attempted, between April and September 1972, to sell 18 kilograms of cocaine in Miami with an estimated value of between $1 million and $4.5 million. So, drug baron Frank Matthews was finally arrested. And just like that, one of the biggest ghosts in the American underworld suddenly became very real to the federal government. Years of money. Years of surveillance. Years of whispers. Years of frustration. Now the cuffs were finally on him. You can almost picture the satisfaction from the agents. The paperwork. The phone calls. The celebration afterward, where exhausted investigators probably smoked half a carton of cigarettes, convincing themselves they finally won. But the thing about Frank Matthews is this. Every time people thought the story was ending, it somehow got stranger. All that remained was to await his trial, scheduled for 7 months later. At the bail hearing, which took place the day after his arrest, Frank showed a certain arrogance towards William Callahan. We were literally face to face. He told us that we had nothing on him and that he would be out in no time. And honestly, that's either the confidence of a genius or the confidence of a lunatic who's been making too much money for too long. He seemed confident, but was soon disillusioned when he heard the amount of bail set by the magistrate: $5 million. The highest bail in the history of the United States at the time. This amount had been set because of Frank Matthews' high risk of absconding and his large fortune. Bail was subsequently reduced to $2.5 million, Frank having agreed not to oppose his extradition to New York. Then it was reduced again to $328,000, a ridiculous sum for a drug lord of Matthews' stature, who unsurprisingly jumped at the chance to regain his freedom. And this right here? This is the moment where history quietly loads the gun. Because everybody involved knew one thing: if Frank Matthews ever got the opportunity to disappear, he probably would. The bail mistake. Yes, Frank Matthews was now free before judgment. A mistake that the American justice system would come to bitterly regret, since the young gangster was not going to wait long to make his move. Frank had regained his freedom and was once again at the head of his criminal organization. For the investigators, this made it difficult to keep an eye on him before the trial. Agent Roger Giray testifies, "We couldn't keep tabs on Matthews. We were stretched thin and simply didn't have the manpower to watch him 24/7. All we could do was hope and pray he would keep showing up in court." Hope. That was the strategy. Not surveillance. Not containment. Not manpower. Hope. which is absolutely incredible when you're talking about a man accused of running one of the largest heroin operations in American history. Imagine being the federal agent hearing this. You mean the multimillionaire international narcotics kingpin is basically on the honor system? Beautiful. Tremendous work, everybody. Hope was all that police had because, in the end, there was nothing to stop Frank Matthews from taking his belongings and disappearing with all his fortune. It has to be said that he was facing a life sentence, and that, in any case, the heroin market was increasingly unstable because of the gradual dismantling of the French Connection. So, based on this observation, there was nothing to stop him from taking off. And from Frank's perspective, the decision probably looked obvious. Stay in America and gamble your life against the federal government. Or leave with millions of dollars while you still can. Most gangsters never get that choice. Usually, they end up dead, betrayed, or sitting in court looking like exhausted raccoons in cheap suits while prosecutors read wiretaps out loud. Frank Matthews had something different. He had time. And time is dangerous when you're dealing with somebody intelligent. Especially somebody who already proved he could outmaneuver both the Mafia and the government. So now the clock was ticking. The authorities believed they had finally cornered Frank Matthews. But in reality, they had just given him the opening he needed. July 2nd, 1973. And that's precisely what happened on July 2nd, 1973, when the accused, Frank Larry Matthews, never showed up for the trial that was to send him to prison. The drug baron had disappeared, declared a fugitive the day after his trial. Just gone. No dramatic shootout, no airport chase, no last stand in a penthouse with helicopters circling overhead like some cheap Hollywood nonsense. Frank Matthews simply vanished. And somehow that makes the story even creepier. Because disappearing is hard. Disappearing when every federal agency in America is looking for you, that's almost impossible. So what had happened? Well, some sources claim that Frank bid farewell to friends and gave away part of his fortune before disappearing for good. We heard Frank left New York with 55-gallon drums filled with money. 55-gallon drums, not briefcases, not duffel bags, industrial-sized containers of cash like some kind of criminal oil operation. That's not a fugitive fleeing anymore. That's a man evacuating an empire. Reggie Collins, a drug dealer at the time, says he was one of the last friends Frank saw before he disappeared. It was 4 a.m. and we were at Flaps on 119th Street. Frank said he was heading out of town and not coming back. I watched him drive off in a 1972 Ford Thunderbird. Black body, white top. Never saw him again. And that image feels almost cinematic. Early morning darkness, the city half asleep. One final goodbye. A Thunderbird disappearing into the night. Then nothing. Frank Matthews is said to have fled, but not alone, it seems, as his mistress, Cheryl Denise Brown, was also nowhere to be found. She disappeared at the same time as Matthews, which suggests that the two ran away together. The authorities also claimed that Frank Matthews laundered up to $20 million to prepare his escape, most likely leaving the country. $20 million in 1973, more than $100 million today, enough money to vanish almost anywhere on Earth if you were smart enough. And Frank Matthews was smart enough. That's the part investigators kept circling back to over and over again. Frank wasn't reckless, he wasn't sloppy, he wasn't emotional, he was calculated. Which is why this disappearance terrified law enforcement. Because if Frank Matthews successfully escaped with that amount of money, then the federal government hadn't just lost a fugitive. They lost the entire ending. The DEA offered a $20,000 reward to anyone who could help capture him. This was the highest reward since the one offered for in 1931. The authorities put out thousands of wanted posters across the country, receiving numerous calls from people claiming to have seen the fugitive. Unfortunately, these leads went nowhere, because Frank Matthews had become something far more difficult to catch than a criminal. He had become a myth. Everybody knows nothing. Getting information out of interviewees was also very difficult. As Glenn Chisholm reports, during the entire time I was involved with the investigation, I never interviewed anybody who actually knew anything about Frank's whereabouts. They would say invariably that if they knew where Frank was, they would not tell us, because Frank was generous with his money. And that tells you something important about Frank Matthews. Fear mattered. But loyalty mattered too. A lot of fugitives get betrayed because eventually somebody gets angry, broke, jealous, or scared enough to talk. But with Frank, people stayed quiet. Maybe because they respected him. Maybe because they feared him. Maybe because somewhere out there they believed he was still alive, still wealthy, and still capable of hearing who opened their mouth. Strangely, no one seemed willing to give any information about Frank Matthews. The investigators therefore interviewed other people, such as Barbara Hinton, Matthews' former wife with whom he had 3 children. We interviewed Barbara at her liquor store. The store was sparsely stocked, and it didn't look to be a moneymaker. Barbara struck me as being bitter. I don't know if she was that way personally or if she was upset that Frank had left her. In any case, we believe she didn't know anything. Al Parrish, Glenn Chisholm's colleague on the Frank Matthews case, also gives us his impressions of the interview with Barbara Hinton. It did not seem that Hinton had any recent contact with Matthews. What kind of man leaves his kids and doesn't show up again? Surely, if he was alive, he'd have stayed in contact with Barbara for the sake of the kids. I just didn't get it. And that's one of the saddest parts of the entire story. Because once you strip away the mythology, the silk suits, the millions, the kingpin reputation, you're left with a man who vanished and never came back for his family. That detail bothers investigators even decades later. Not because gangsters are known for emotional stability, let's not get carried away here, but because Frank Matthews was repeatedly described as intelligent and loyal to the people around him. So either he willingly cut himself off forever to protect the escape, or something happened to him before he ever had the chance to return. And honestly, that question hangs over this whole case like smoke. Because if Frank Matthews really escaped successfully, why disappear completely? No secret phone calls. No hidden financial support, no confirmed contact, nothing. For a man who once controlled millions of dollars and entire criminal networks, the silence afterward feels almost unnatural, which is exactly why some investigators slowly began wondering if Frank Matthews wasn't hiding at all. Maybe he was already dead. The Ali Frazier lead. The Frank Matthews lead became weaker as time went on. Investigators Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish, who were working on the case, were quite critical of Gerard Miller, the man who had led Group 12 and charged Matthews, because according to them, Miller had done a poor job by thinking he knew everything about Frank, when in fact there was very little to go on. What's more, on examining the files, the investigators noticed that at one point, Frank Matthews had been prepared to cooperate with the authorities on the condition that they left some of his men alone. An offer Miller allegedly refused, which made no sense. That was stupid. We already had them on the wiretaps. On top of that, somebody spooked Matthews by telling him he was going to get life. You'd never say that. Matthews must have felt as if he had no choice but to run. And if that's true, that changes the entire story. Because suddenly Frank Matthews doesn't look like a reckless kingpin fleeing in panic. He looks like a strategist making a calculated exit after realizing the system had already decided his fate. In any case, the investigators continued their work, which brings us to January 28, 1974, the day Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish went to watch the second fight between, and the aim was to catch Frank Matthews, a die-hard Muhammad Ali fan. The two investigators had been informed that Frank had undergone cosmetic surgery to modify his features and thus go incognito. Glenn Chisholm recalls, "I was really excited. I was going to an Ali Frazier fight and catch a big fugitive too. The experience was really something for a young agent like me. And honestly, you can almost feel the optimism there. Young federal agents walking into one of the most famous boxing events in history, thinking, 'Tonight's the night. We finally get him.' That's movie stuff right there." That day, at least 20,000 people attended the legendary fight. The agents arrived early to observe the crowd and tried to take photos, but nothing. Not a single sign of Frank Matthews. It was another failure. Another rumor. Another dead end. Another moment where the ghost slipped through their fingers. And after a while, that starts doing something to investigators, psychologically. Because eventually you stop feeling like you're chasing a fugitive, and start feeling like you're chasing a legend people invented to torture you. The case goes cold. A year went by, and the investigation group, which included Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish, had not made one iota of progress. It turns out that the investigators had spent an enormous amount of time looking for clues, examining the slightest piece of evidence, traveling across the United States and abroad to follow up potential leads, and in the end, they had achieved very little. In the end, they knew as much about African-American gangster Frank Matthews' disappearance as they did at the start. A status quo that prompted the DEA to disband the investigation group. We felt like we had wasted our time and had gotten nowhere. The DEA didn't have its act together. That's a brutal admission. Not from conspiracy theorists. Not from internet storytellers. From the people actually working the case. And honestly, you can understand the frustration. Imagine spending years chasing one man across continents, only to end up with a stack of rumors, blurry sightings, and exhausted agents chain-smoking under fluorescent office lights, wondering where it all went wrong. The investigation was then handed over to the U.S. Marshals, who took up the case from scratch, given the paucity of information on the fugitive. But here, too, as time went on, leads became increasingly scarce. The DEA, which had kept the Matthews file open and continued the search, then saw a new generation of agents arrive in the following decades, who certainly knew Frank, but had other things to worry about. This was a time when major drug traffickers in Colombia and Mexico were monopolizing all the attention of the American authorities, and the Frank Matthews case was no longer the DEA's priority. That's another thing time does to investigations. It doesn't just erase evidence, it changes priorities. New cartels appear. New wars begin. New headlines dominate television. And eventually, yesterday's kingpin becomes an old file cabinet nobody opens anymore except retired agents and obsessed investigators. So, the U.S. Marshals took over the case and tried to locate him themselves. But it was always the same scenario. Mike Pizzi, a member of the U.S. Marshals who oversaw the investigation against Frank Matthews, recalls, "We spent countless hours pursuing and harassing everyone we thought knew Matthews or who had contact with him. Some people were hassled to the point that they found it necessary to change their locations. Others got used to seeing us on a regular basis, and they didn't like it. A frontal strategy, but one that had its limits. As Dave Filete, also a member of the U.S. Marshals, points out, we didn't shake up anything. We asked someone, did you see Frank? They'd try to play us. They'd say, got some money, brother. I'll tell you. We concluded that nobody we talked to knew anything and that Frank Matthews was no longer in New York City. And that realization changed everything. Because once investigators accepted Frank Matthews probably wasn't in New York anymore, the search stopped being local law enforcement work. Now it became archaeology. Digging through decades trying to find traces of a man who may have erased himself better than any criminal in modern American history. Was he dead? The U.S. Marshals continued to search, then took a closer look at the 3 sons Frank had left behind. That's when they learned that one of them was in prison for stealing cars. This was surprising, as Frank was known to be a good father. But to go from a caring father to a heartless one was strange. A suspicion shared by Mike Pizzi, who states, if Matthews had $20 million when he left and he was still alive, what was his son doing stealing cars? I didn't feel that Frank had reached out to his family since he disappeared. And that detail hit investigators hard, because it contradicted the mythology. The legend says Frank Matthews escaped with millions and disappeared into luxury somewhere overseas. But reality looked different. His family wasn't living like the relatives of a hidden kingpin. There were no signs of secret support, no protected empire, no hidden pipeline of money, just silence. Had he deliberately cut himself off from those closest to him to ensure an effective escape? If so, it was surprising. What if, after all, Frank Matthews was dead? Of course, no fingerprints or traces of his body have been found, but there are theories that point in that direction. Many people interviewed by the investigators have said that Frank Matthews is no longer with us. Deborah Nightwine, a member of the U.S. Marshal Service, seems to share this opinion. The Matthews investigation was the most frustrating case I ever worked. I literally worked the case 24/7. I followed through on every lead. By the end of the assignment, I began thinking that maybe the reason I didn't find anything solid was because Frank Matthews was dead. Mike Pizzi also believes in this hypothesis. Being the ultimate optimist, I originally believed we could find and arrest him. My deputies and I worked many cases where the investigation took us far and wide. Usually, we had a piece of information or a lead that was solid, even in cases where the fugitive was now 1 month ahead of us, or a state or county away from the last sighting or the last verifiable piece of information. But I don't recall a case from the past 40 or more years that involves a fugitive fleeing with a young girlfriend and both of them disappearing without a trace. And that's the part investigators could never fully explain. 2 people. Millions of dollars. An international manhunt. And not one confirmed trace. No body. No fingerprints. No photographs. No reliable sightings. Nothing. That's extraordinarily rare. Because even the smartest fugitives usually make mistakes eventually. Somebody talks. Somebody slips up. Somebody gets spotted drunk in a casino wearing sunglasses indoors like an idiot. But Frank Matthews? It was as if the earth swallowed him whole. And after enough years passed, investigators started confronting the possibility they hated most. Maybe they weren't hunting a fugitive anymore. Maybe they were hunting a ghost. The Mafia theory. But if African-American gangster Frank Matthews was dead, what happened to him? Seth Ferranti, an author who has taken an interest in Frank's life, has his own idea. I subscribe to the theory that the mob had him whacked because he knew too much about their operations. And also because if he really had $20 million cash, as the legend says, the mob wanted that money for sure. Plus, Frank's organization was in shambles, and he was on the run from the feds. Whether arrested, indicted, or in jail, Frank didn't have the juice he once had, so it was easier for the mob to move on him. I believe that is what happened. Frank is sleeping with the fishes somewhere. A plausible theory in the sense that Frank didn't like the Mafia, and the Mafia didn't like him either. And honestly, that might be the understatement of the century. Because from the Mafia's perspective, Frank Matthews represented something dangerous. Not just competition, proof. Proof that somebody outside their system could become richer than them, operate independently, and survive without kissing the ring. That kind of success creates enemies fast. First of all, we know that some New York mobsters didn't like Frank coming to Tot Hill. As Gerard Miller explains, we know the mob was really upset with Frank's presence in Tot Hill. We learned that the mob sent a delegation to see Frank and tell him he was out of his league. La Cosa Nostra, in fact, was so upset that Group 12 even started to receive anonymous intelligence from sources living across the street from the Matthews family. They were telling us about what was happening at Frank's place. That's incredible. The mobsters hated him so much they allegedly started feeding information to the authorities out of spite. That's basically organized crime HOA behavior. Excuse me, officer, the gentleman across the street is making entirely too much heroin money. The mobster even wanted to eliminate Frank, according to the police, who overheard him on a telephone tap. A death threat taken seriously by Matthews, who then tried to arrange a meeting with Castellano. Then there was the time Frank Matthews kidnapped an associate of the Genovese family in revenge for another of the family's associates ripping him off in a drug deal. A totally insane act that could have led the Mafia to eliminate him too. Because you have to understand something. The Mafia tolerated business disputes. What they didn't tolerate was humiliation. And Frank Matthews had reached a point where he wasn't just refusing to obey them anymore. He was openly challenging them, publicly, financially, territorially. So Frank Matthews eliminated by the Mafia? That might be the understatement of the century. Because from the Mafia's perspective, Matthews represented something dangerous, not just competition. Proof. Proof that somebody outside their system could become richer than them, operate independently, and survive without kissing the ring. That kind of success creates enemies fast. First of all, we know that some New York mobsters didn't like African-American gangster Frank Matthews coming to Tot Hill. As Gerard Miller explains, we know the mob was really upset with Frank's presence in Tot Hill. We learned that the mob sent a delegation to see Frank and tell him he was out of his league. La Cosa Nostra, in fact, was so upset that Group 12 even started to receive anonymous intelligence from sources living across the street from the Matthews family. They were telling us about what was happening at Frank's place. That's incredible. The mobsters hated him so much they allegedly started feeding information to the authorities out of spite. That's basically organized crime HOA behavior. Excuse me, officer. The gentleman across the street is making entirely too much heroin money. The mobster even wanted to eliminate Frank, according to the police, who overheard him on a telephone tap. A death threat taken seriously by Matthews, who then tried to arrange a meeting with Castellano. Then there was the time Frank Matthews kidnapped an associate of the Genovese family in revenge for another of the family's associates ripping him off in a drug deal. A totally insane act that could have led the Mafia to eliminate him too. Because you have to understand something. The Mafia tolerated business disputes. What they didn't tolerate was humiliation. And Frank Matthews had reached a point where he wasn't just refusing to obey them anymore. He was openly challenging them. Publicly. Financially. Territorially. Yes, it's quite likely. Especially once he became vulnerable. Because while Frank Matthews may have built an empire powerful enough to rival organized crime, the moment he went on the run, he also became isolated. And isolated gangsters rarely survive long. The Corsican and CIA theory. But it's also possible that he died of a cocaine overdose, since it was known that he had a strong addiction to the drug and that he had heart problems. Or we could believe this other theory of assassination. A theory involving Frank Matthews, the CIA, the Corsicans, and Venezuela. Now, this is where the story starts entering truly dangerous territory. Not street rumors. Not neighborhood mythology. International narcotics pipelines. Intelligence agencies. Foreign operations. And millions of dollars disappearing through the cracks of the Cold War. Because at the time, Frank is said to have scuppered the Corsicans' drug trafficking network in Venezuela. Group 12, which was investigating Frank at the time, had recovered telephone taps in which Frank was heard revealing information about this connection, which subsequently enabled the authorities to dismantle the network. This incident is said to have infuriated the Corsicans, who pointed the finger at Matthews and named him as the main culprit behind the huge loss of money. And organized crime groups can forgive a lot of things. Debt. Insults. Ego. What they never forgive is somebody costing them millions. The fact that the Corsicans had to change their supply route to Miami may therefore have prompted them to want to eliminate Frank, as did the CIA, which had interests in the region. While we have no way of knowing what the CIA thought about the Venezuelan bust, they must have been furious with Matthews as well, because the agency was very active in Venezuela. So, in my view, the Venezuelan bust probably screwed up, or at least interfered with, their plans. Now, before people start screaming conspiracy theories while wearing aluminum foil hats and yelling at pigeons in parking lots, it's important to say there's no definitive proof the CIA harmed Frank Matthews. But the overlap between intelligence agencies, narcotics trafficking routes, anti-communist operations, and covert interests in Latin America during that era, that part is absolutely real history. So we have the Corsican Mafia on one side and the CIA on the other, both of whom had something against Frank. Two big entities that would have had no trouble making him disappear without a trace. I began to change my opinion about Matthews after learning about his connections to the Corsicans and the CIA, and to Rolando Gonzalez and Venezuela. Put all that together and put $10 or $20 million in cash in Matthews' hands, and I could see him headed for a hole in the ground without his money and with Brown right next to him. Matthews was no longer an asset, and as a fugitive he was a liability. And honestly, the vanishing. So, was Frank Matthews murdered? Unfortunately, we can only speculate on this possibility. These and other rumors only add to the Frank Matthews mystery. Some think he's dead. Others think he's still alive and kicking, and that he pulled off the biggest disappearance in the history of crime. What's certain is that the more the years go by, the less likely it is that we'll ever discover the truth about this story. The story of a drug lord who, overnight, disappeared from the face of the earth without a trace. What happened to Frank Matthews after his disappearance? It's a question that I fear will remain forever unanswered. His body never turned up. Cheryl Brown's body never turned up. No bones were ever located. It's very, very unusual in cold case homicide cases where a body never turns up. He covered his path very well. And maybe that's the final lesson of Frank Matthews. Not the money. Not the drugs. Not the empire. The disappearance. Because criminals usually leave something behind. A witness. A fingerprint. A wiretap. A body in a shallow grave. A drunk cousin who talks too much at Thanksgiving. Something. But Frank Matthews left almost nothing. Just theories. A few photographs. Old federal files. Rumors whispered in barber shops and social clubs. Frank Matthews remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of organized crime. A man born in poverty who built an empire powerful enough to challenge the Mafia itself. A kingpin who rose faster than law enforcement could understand him. And a fugitive who vanished so completely that half a century later, investigators still debate whether they were hunting a living man or a dead one. The files remain open. The questions remain unanswered. And somewhere between fact, myth, fear, and rumor, the legend of Frank Matthews still survives. Frank Matthews remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of organized crime. A man born in poverty who built an empire powerful enough to challenge the Mafia itself. A kingpin who rose faster than law enforcement could understand him. And a fugitive who vanished so completely that half a century later, investigators still debate whether they were hunting a living man or a dead one. The files remain open. The questions remain unanswered. And somewhere between fact, myth, fear, and rumor, the legend of Frank Matthews still survives. If you enjoy deep documentaries about organized crime, unsolved disappearances, forgotten history, political corruption, federal investigations, underworld power struggles, and the stories buried beneath the official narrative, then welcome to the Pizzaverse. This isn't the sanitized History Channel version. This isn't Hollywood mythology wrapped in pretty lighting and dramatic piano music. This is the dirt underneath the fingernails, the wiretaps, the rumors, the lies, the missing files, the uncomfortable questions nobody can answer. Because the deeper you go into stories like Frank Matthews, the more you realize something. History is not clean. It's messy. Contradictory. Violent. Manipulated. And sometimes deliberately buried. That's why we're here. The Pizzaverse doesn't rewrite history. We excavate it. So subscribe, step into the social club, grab an espresso, and stay dangerous. Because there are always more stories hidden underneath the surface. Thank you for watching. This has been a Pizzaverse Studios documentary, a Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. And to everybody supporting the channel, sharing the videos, joining the premieres, and keeping these stories alive, grazie paison. Because without you, these stories fade into forgotten case files and dusty archive boxes. But here in the Pizzaverse, the dead stories still talk. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the ghosts arguing about who really ran New York. Until next time, stay curious, stay dangerous, and remember, the truth is usually buried under the official story. Frank Matthews, the the ghost of the American underworld. Built a heroin empire bigger than most corporations, moved millions across 21 states, annoyed both the Mafia and the federal government, then vanished with enough money to make accountants cry themselves to sleep. The DEA spent decades looking for him and basically got back a collection of rumors and migraines. Nicky Barnes. Harlem's self-proclaimed Mr. Untouchable. Flashy suits, luxury cars, heroin money, and enough ego to end up on magazine covers while the feds were actively hunting him. Eventually discovered the streets don't honor loyalty clauses and became an informant faster than a guy returning cold soup at a deli. Paul Castellano. The corporate CEO version of a mafia boss. Preferred boardroom energy over street violence. Made fortunes through organized crime and allegedly hated drug trafficking, bringing heat onto the families. Ironically, ended up becoming one of the most famous steakhouse reservations in mob history.
Hello friends, it's me Giacomo, at Giacomo A on the YouTube. So, anyway, when I am not on the Facebook groups begging for views, subs, and people to buy my books, I am here with you, begging with you to buy my books, because JJ Lambon and Elisa Pizza Piescia, Pizzitola, damaged my books. Bambi Palermo did too. So, anyways, buy the books, please. I am begging.
Hello friends, join me tonight on my YouTube channel at Giacomo A to hear my story about the underworld 80s mobsters.
A good father, 2 sons and a daughter, but he wakes up and he asks himself, why even bother if he cannot feed his family? The wage he's paid's insanity. Every day he's dealing with a new calamity. Lost his old occupation, but it wasn't immigration. It was a machine, automation that replaced him. Politicians left him corruption since the recession. So he grabs his Smith & Wesson, says he'll teach him all the lesson like, get down on the ground. It's a stick up, nobody make a sound. Don't even hiccup or I'm emptying around. I'm done playing games, so I'm going down in flames. Let it rain over Washington. It's a stick up, nobody make a sound. Don't even hiccup or I'm emptying around. I'm done playing games, so I'm going down in flames. Let it rain over Washington. His pension, sunk into depression. Congress is defecting, it's been adding to the tension. Came back from war and he's been post-traumatic stressing. Can't afford his medicine he took for his aggression. He needs help, relying on the system that